Yeah, it sucked. But why? I think it goes without saying that Shadowlands, this recent WoW expansion, was not very well received from a story perspective by the greater World of Warcraft community. And that's kind of strange, isn't it, considering how much creativity there was in this expansion when you think about it. We got to go to these various afterlives about vampires that drink sin like it's wine, this weird blue people and owl people purgatory, giant undead arenas with magic and necromancers, nature and such, and we just learned more about how the afterlives were created, and we learned more about creation itself and how it works in the World of Warcraft. And yet, despite all of this creativity, there was an absolutely huge amount of community backlash against this expansion. People did not connect even in the slightest with this story and what Blizzard was trying to tell. But again, why did this happen? Well, in my opinion, I've narrowed it down to two main reasons. Two things that I think made the Shadowlands storyline one of the absolute worst stories in World of Warcraft. So to begin, let us discuss point number one, and that is Sylvanas Windrunner. Sylvanas has been a fan favorite character in World of Warcraft for years, ever since her introduction back in Warcraft 3, and she has been at the center of World of Warcraft ever since she became the war chief of the Horde. Now you would think that a character like Sylvanas, a character so beloved by the community for so many years, would be a recipe for success for Blizzard. They'd put her at the forefront for a time, she would lead the story, it would be fantastic, and yet that's not at all what happened. From my personal perspective, what Blizzard did with Sylvanas is they really tried to push her as this strong female character at the head of the World of Warcraft story. But the problem was, Blizzard, despite giving her all these power-ups and giving her these badass lines and stuff, really trying to push that strong female archetype, the biggest issue with this was the fact that, well, Sylvanas was already a strong female character. She didn't need to be any stronger. In Warcraft 3, she was a defender of her people, a defender of Quel'Tha Lost. She fought against Arthas. She was ultimately killed, raised as a banshee. She broke free of the Lich King's control, and then she rallied together all the survivors of Lordaeron, undead humans and undead blood elves who had broken free from the Lich King's control, and was leading a rebellion against the Scourge in Lordaeron in order to reclaim the homeland of her people as well as the people of Lordaeron. And yet in the shadows, despite her heroism, Sylvanas bore this sort of grudge against life itself, the life that had rejected her and her people. And so in the shadows of the Apothecarium, Sylvanas and her vile Forsaken alchemists were brewing a new plague of undeath that would kill both Scourge and living alike to make everybody monsters just like they were. And that's it. That's who Sylvanas was in Classic WoW and Warcraft 3. And you know what? It was absolutely fantastic, and it was absolutely beautiful. She was a character that seemed heroic on the surface, and yet deep down, she was evil. She was a villain, and she cared for nobody but herself and her own people. But over the years, Blizzard sort of isolated Sylvanas. She didn't care about the Forsaken anymore, all she cared about were her own goals, and suddenly she was in league with this 15-foot-tall vampire bodybuilder, and they were trying to destroy all life itself and rewrite the cosmos or something and blah blah blah, and it just didn't work. Sylvanas had always been a character that had operated from the shadows, ambushing people when they least expected it, working on plagues of undeath down in the dark caverns of the Undercity. This was a character that never should have been brought to the forefront. She never should have been War Chief. She never should have been at the front of a storyline. Making her the War Chief and making her in league with this big 15-foot-tall vampire bodybuilder, and they're trying to rewrite creation and the cosmos and stuff, it just doesn't work. It's Blizzard trying to take a strong female character and make her a stronger female character, which didn't work, and them not understanding who she was as a character and how her story should have played out. So instead, they just made this some old bullshit up with the Shadowlands, and it fell flat on its face. The reality is, unfortunately, when it came to Shadowlands, everything revolved around Sylvanas. And at this point, if you were somebody that just hated Sylvanas as a character, or you were someone like me that loved Sylvanas as a character beforehand, but you felt that Blizzard downgraded her in quality in terms of her writing and character development, then this expansion was just gonna suck because it just all revolved around her. And the unfortunate truth is that going into Shadowlands, most people could not stand Sylvanas Windrunner and how Blizzard were developing her as a character. And because she was at the center of the Shadowlands expansion, nobody liked the storyline because they didn't care about the main character. And now I want to talk about the second reason why Shadowlands failed, and this is something that I've hinted at in previous videos and on Twitch streams, but that's just simply the fact that Shadowlands was very strange. It wasn't really an expansion built upon any pre-established World of Warcraft lore, if you think about it. It was kind of a pure shot in the dark sort of expansion. We were going to the afterlives, which was a subject that had never been explored before in previous Warcraft titles, and we were interacting with people that just didn't really... we didn't know anything about them. We were going to these lands where vampires were drinking sin like wine and meeting people like Sire Denathrius, and this was fine, I guess, but then suddenly you would go from hanging out with a bunch of vampires to suddenly being in purgatory with a bunch of blue people and talking owls. Then suddenly you're in some nature area with this Elune ripoff lady. And then the next thing you're fighting in like arenas with a bunch of undead and necromancers. It was just kind of all over the place. And then you had this big guy called the Jailer, and he was trying to rewrite reality and rewrite the cosmos to prepare us for what was to come or something. So he was actually the good guy or whatever in some weird way of looking at it. Despite a lot of creativity in Shadowlands, the story and the locations all felt very random. And although they were connected, sort of, it all felt very, well, disconnected. But overall, I think the worst sin that Blizzard committed, like genuinely the worst sin that got people just riled up, was when Blizzard decided to touch World of Warcraft's most famous character, Arthas the Lich King. And they tried to paint it like Zoval, this jailer guy, was behind the Lich King. He was actually his creator. He's more powerful than the Lich King. The Lich King was just a pawn in his scheme. Everything was just a pawn in his great plan, and everything that had happened so far had been orchestrated by him. This sort of crap never works. The only time this sort of storytelling works is when you can genuinely look back over like the years or over the course of the story and be like, oh, and you can see the clues. Like you can see people all the way back in classic WoW saying, ah, yes, one day you shall all know the pains of his prisons or something. And it all just kind of builds up until you say, oh, here's the guy that everybody's been talking about over the years. But here's the thing, nobody since Warcraft 3 ever mentioned some big-ass guy named the Jailer. There was no references to this character. There was nothing. All the events of Warcraft 3 and in World of Warcraft were not a part of this dumbass's plan? Of course it wasn't. It's ridiculous that they even put that forward. I'm getting passionate about it just talking about it. And you can see what I'm talking about. People hate this sort of storytelling because it came out of nowhere and it spit upon the previous stories that had been told and the characters that had been told, saying, oh, hey, you know those like characters that you know and love from back in the day? Well, they were just puppets on the string of this really cool new character that we developed. His name's Zoval and he's badass. Guess what? He's not. No one likes him. Get rid of him. I'm glad that we did. Shadowlands failed mostly because of those two reasons. Nobody liked Sylvanas, and Sylvanas was the center of the expansion, and so nobody cared about her story. Nobody cared about her choices. People just wanted to kill her, collect her loot, and make her go away. And then the other thing was just how random and disconnected everything felt in Shadowlands, from the zones and the locations to the story to even the main villain. And despite Blizzard trying to create a sort of connectivity with like the rest of the world and its storyline, trying to say things like the Jailer was behind it all, it just didn't work. It fell flat on its face. So that's why I think the story of Shadowlands failed, but I will say that I think that the story of Dragonflight is looking a lot more interesting. In fact, tremendously more interesting for several reasons. But I'm going to talk about that in another video at a later time. For most of us though, we've all quit Shadowlands and we're all playing Wrath of the Lich King. But for those people that are not playing Wrath of the Lich King because maybe you don't understand why Wrath of the Lich King is so significant, or those of you that have never played Wrath of the Lich King before and you don't know the history of the expansion and why so many people are hyped for it, I highly recommend you watch this video on your screen right now called Why is Wrath of the Lich King Such a Big Deal? It will answer all those questions for you guys and a whole lot more. Thanks for watching, everybody.